Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone. Thanks for coming. So I want to start off with just general takeaways from the three of you about what happened last week, what the results meant, and also a little bit about what your role was. I should know this, but I don't really know what the Working Families Party director does on election day or the days before that. So everybody talk about what you were doing in the weeks before the election as well. So start with Fess.
Thank you, Perry, and nice to be with you all. Appreciate the invitation. So a couple of things. One, I kind of wear two hats. So one is with Senator Sanders, we traveled all over the country. Bernie did 19 stops over 7 states in the course of 10 days, hit a bunch of campuses. We're at the, rattle them off, Oregon, California, Nevada, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, largely rallying a youth vote. And we were very pleased to see that in the normal midterm cycles, you have significant youth drop-off, and we did not have significant youth drop-off. We had huge lines, particularly in the races that mattered. A big deal was a deciding factor, so we were pretty happy with that. With another hat, obviously, run More Perfect Union and journalism content around economic justice issues, and on that score very quickly, I think Lindsay mentioned it in her opening remarks, is if you had done survey research, and we did survey research, you saw some of it yourself, Perry. If you did this last year and you asked people what's the cause for inflation, a plurality would have told you a version of Joe Biden or Democratic policies. And over the course of a year and a half, we changed that narrative, working together with a bunch of people in this room, such that on Election Day 2022, Biden Democratic policies were not seen as a major driver of inflation, and rightly so. I think corporate greed and to some degree the war in Ukraine and snarled supply chains were seen as the cause for inflation, and that mattered so much at a point where voters were going into the voting booths voting on economy as the number one issue, recognizing inflation was something serious to be dealt with, and saying that the Biden path seems much more appropriate than whatever these Republicans are offering. And I think that was a credit to everybody who helped build a movement to say, let's discuss why inflation in America is happening, and proud to say we played some part in that.
So thank you for moderating, and thank you all. So the Working Families Party, for those of you that don't know about us, we're a national political movement that essentially believes that our politics should work for the many and not the few. We're a independent political party with a ballot line in New York and Connecticut, and we do a lot of work all across the country. So we endorsed close to 1,000 people around the country in a number of states. And in the days before the election, I was crisscrossing states, intersecting with Bernie in a few places. I was in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, a lot of the swing states, on the ground with our activists and organizers and our candidates, was with Summer Lee in Pittsburgh. Shout out to Summer Lee, who'll be, joining a number of others. We had a wonderful election day by all measures. Also, we as a country had a wonderful election day. And I think one of the reasons why is voters, and there was work done to make this happen, voters were voting against fascism. And there was a lot of work to be able to connect the dots between abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, our economic rights, and the ways that Republicans on the far right were a collective force to reduce our rights, and voting with Democrats was a path towards expanding our rights and preventing, and also our democracy. So that's pretty clear. But also, voters were voting for something. And I think if the Biden administration and the Congress hadn't delivered more than $4 trillion of resources on the ground through the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislation, I think we would have been in a different place. But we had something when we were knocking, so we hit more than 1 million doors around the country, 5 million phone conversations, 40 million texts. We had something to say. Outside of, the Republicans are scary, we actually had a message aligned with concrete solutions that Democrats were actually delivering on. And then the last thing, there's been a lot of talk about abortion, which is many things. It's a public health issue, it's a gender issue, it is a human rights issue, and it's also an economic issue. The ability for working people to be able to plan their families is a fundamental economic right, right? As anybody should know, if they're thinking about planning a family or if they have a family, right? Children are expensive, right? And so people understood that. They understood what was at stake. They understood the stark nature of what was at stake, and they voted accordingly in historic ways. And we were able to at least buy ourselves some time. The Trump movement is still alive, but we've at least been able to buy ourselves some time in order to do the organizing. It's like a monster movie where there's 30 minutes left of runtime, but you think the monster's dead, but there's more movie to go. I think we're in that moment, and we're gonna have to continue to keep this electoral momentum going into more organizing, more governance in order to consistently demonstrate that contrast between us and the far right.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So I'm a pollster, and I spent the last 2 years polling in races across the country. My firm, I did 5 statewide and about 8 congressional races, but my firm overall worked in about 35 races in just about every state where there were congressional and statewide races. And so I went to bed on Tuesday night at 3 in the morning just going, I'm so happy, I'm so happy, I'm so happy. Not only because Democrats won and I think saved democracy. I think that if Democrats had lost, our democracy would be in serious jeopardy, and it still has a lot of problems and there's a lot of danger, but we're in a much better position than we are if we'd had election deniers as Secretary of States in Michigan and Arizona and places like that. Also really pleased for my industry and my profession that the polling actually did pretty well this cycle. But let me just say a couple of things about, when we, for statewide races, we're already doing research, in 2021, and then with congressionals, the research starts in 2022. And in the early research that we did, one of our biggest challenges was the economy. It certainly, inflation grew over the course of 2022, and really the peak where if you looked at the polls where Democrats are doing the worst in the cycle was in like June, that's when gas prices were about $6 a gallon, depending on where you lived. But the challenge even leading up to that, coming out of COVID and this kind of strange economic recovery, was people feeling deeply insecure, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, had a sense that Biden was going to come in and fix things, and it didn't quite work out. Afghanistan really undermined confidence in him as a president, even though that's not directly related to the economy. It kind of undermined a sense that he was in control and a strong leader, and it was a real blow from a voter perspective. And so we had to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we talk about the economy and trying to find the balance between sort of talking about accomplishments, the things that Maurice is talking about, the Inflation Reduction Act, Rescue Plan, in a way that's credible to people. Because, to be honest with you, a lot of people didn't feel the direct effects of those programs. So, particularly with the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, that none of it's happened yet. Right? The $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs is not happening until next year. Medicare negotiation hasn't happened yet. So the talking about these accomplishments when people don't even feel them yet. And so, you would do focus groups and you'd talk about them and people would say, well, I didn't get that. I don't see that. So how do you talk about it? And we spent a lot of time, and there was a lot of commentary out of Washington about what Democrats should be doing in these different races without them actually going and looking and seeing what we were doing. But in every race I did, we ran ads about the economy, and we did 2 things. One, for lack of a better way of talking about it, we felt people's pain. Right, we had to acknowledge that people were struggling, acknowledge that anxiety, acknowledge that uncertainty. Otherwise, you sound completely out of touch. And then talk about, the economic measures putting in place that eventually will make things better, but not going out there and saying things are better now. And then linking it to a few things, but most importantly, linking it to corporate greed. So particularly around gas prices. As you know, the House passed legislation around price gouging. But I certainly had people running for Senate and governor who talked about it too, even though it didn't pass the Senate and wasn't the law of the land. A lot of discussion about corporate greed, excess profits, taxing excess profits, returning money to folks, but also in terms of prescription drugs and talking about finally being able to defeat, prescription drug companies and being able to force them to table to negotiate with Medicare. So we couldn't say we've lowered your cost right now, but we could say what our values were, why we did it, who we went up against, and what eventually it's going to do. I do think going forward, Democrats are going to have to continue to be very careful in how we talk about the economy, because things are not going to get better for people right away. Many of the things in the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the things that I always said to a number of my candidates was, I don't want to put the $2,000 number in an ad, because for most seniors pay less than $2,000 a year for the prescription drugs. And so it's actually a fairly small number of seniors who will benefit from it. So we need to be really careful in talking about what we've done so that we are credible with folks, and that we ultimately, in electoral terms, get some credit for doing that work.
So you all hit some of it, but I don't think the terms student loan forgiveness or infrastructure was necessarily used by, I guess you mentioned infrastructure a little bit, but drill down a little more about which economic ideas or economic policies or messages really resonated, and then if you don't mind, which ones didn't. I'll start with Anna.
Sure. So I think it's complicated, right? Very complicated, because you have both a very, very strong support for progressive economic policies, but also some resistance to economic policies that benefit, are not linked to work, are not linked, and I'm not talking about this from a moral perspective, I'm talking from a voter perspective and what I hear in focus groups, just to be clear. And so, there are certain policies, like the child tax credit, for example, that, there was some resistance to, right? Even though you poll it and it polls really well, when you're in focus groups and you talk to people about it, there's a conservative perspective around, parents and families are responsible for their children. The government is not responsible. So if you decide to have children, it's expensive. That's something that you sort of own. It's not the government's job to give you a child tax credit. There was also a sense that it went to people who didn't need it. The tension between something that's means tested, but then if it's so narrowly distributed, then it feels like welfare. So I think that the right choice was to have pretty high level of eligibility, but there were people in folks who said, I got the child's credit and I went out to dinner, right? So I didn't need it. And so there are policies like that test very well and are obviously incredibly important in terms of lifting kids out of poverty, but it's really tricky to figure out how to implement it in a way that feels inclusive. And I think a lot of, so I think you have to look at and so I think student loans has that same issue, right? Everybody agrees that we have a problem, right? That this debt is bad debt and it hurts our economy and hurts individual people. And people agree that predatory lenders and for-profit colleges are the bad actors here, and people have been duped and screwed. At the same time, you get this, if you give this benefit, eliminating student debt for the certain group, why are only certain people getting it? Or I paid off my loans yesterday. Why is the person today getting theirs, right? And so these are really, really tricky. And so what we found in the campaign world, we didn't really talk about the child tax credit and student loans. We talked about Medicare negotiation, prescription drugs. We talked about insulin cap. We talked about things that were kind of that a very broad application, right? And very clear, broad, benefit. And I think that's always the tension with progressive economic policy, is how do you make sure the right people are helped by it without it becoming a stigmatized program? It's just always going to be the challenge.
Royce.
Yeah, I would agree that one of the economic policies that when we were at the doors, we were having conversations with, and I think is both universally popular, and it's something that Democrats consistently have as one of their core positions, is the ability to control the prices of life-saving drugs. And we also, it's one of the reasons why we primary some Democrats when they don't go along with that, because we think it's one of the ways where Democrats need to be consistent, and it builds the coalition to include a lot of independents and other people who agree with it, and we know that's an area that Republicans just will go. I would say, though, as it relates to, looking at the audience, I see some people who might be college age or soon out of college.
All of you look very young to me.
the cancellation of student debt struck a chord that mobilized the base of the Democratic Party that I think was very helpful for Democrats. I hear smatterings, right? And, you know, it was, from our standpoint, in our base, with our volunteer base, and the energy needed to get people who are giving their volunteer hours and small dollar donations and feeling inspired and breaking off the patina of cynicism that gets them in motion. Concrete victories like that was, to me, very electorally helpful in terms of the people who are the base and the sort of core of what it actually takes to mobilize folks into winning an election. It's not necessarily just about the sort of popularity of a particular position. It's about how that position might mobilize people to believe that they need to get in motion and organize in order to get one party or another towards victory. And I saw that with student debt, which isn't just, young people or people who just came out of college. It's, I'm in my 40s and I have a lot of contemporaries that had student debt, that still have student debt. I only recently cleared my student debt. So, and I think all of these are complicated, right? Because based on the polling, it's one of the reasons why a lot of these economic policies have means tests. I tend to think from a policy standpoint, there's problems with means testing because then the policy has an arbitrary cutoff and then you almost create a constituency of people who get it and people who don't, which again makes it harder to maintain the policy once it becomes law, right? But certainly in terms of what I saw working, I think broadly popular, anything related to healthcare, because that hits people in such a fundamental place across identity, across politics. And then, the student debt, it was like a shot in the arm that we noticed in our ranks that was undeniable.
I would say that they didn't hear enough about us on the economy. They did not hear enough on an economic contrast. And I say that as someone who is pleased with the outcome, very excited about the outcome. I think the message around abortion rights got through loud and clear. The message on the assault on our democracy got through loud and clear. And those were undoubtedly significant factors in driving and mobilizing a Democratic base and coalescing us to have the turnout we needed to maintain essentially the Biden coalition that helped him win in 2020 and then helped us maintain essentially the same seats in 2022. And I say all that saying, now look at all the potential opportunities that are presented to us to get the next 2, 3, 4, 5% in the next cycle, because we didn't even get aggressive about an economic contrast. Think of what that would look like. Think about aggressively campaigning on Medicare expansion, Social Security expansion, right? It's one thing to say, hey, these guys want to attack and kill Social Security, and you did hear that, and President Obama deserves a lot of credit for probably most effectively animating that at a time of need. And yet, you did not get that as a loud and proud brand enough, in my view. Do people know that we love Social Security and Medicare? Yeah, I think they do. Do they hear us actively advocating for the expansion of it? Probably not. Do they know that we want to take on corporate greed in the way of wanting to institute a windfall profits tax on oil companies? Do you think that got through? I don't think so. To our credit, President's credit, I think he said it near the end of the campaign and suggested he would do it. I would argue to you it's one of the most popular things you could do. I mean, Anna could correct me on the survey results, but if you didn't, let's go ahead and test it. Expanding Medicare, expanding Social Security, instituting windfall profits tax on the rich, and then giving a rebate back to consumers in their pocketbooks. Let's test it. Let's run. And to my mind, one of the frustrations I had and I still carry is that while we had this great success, right, we did, excellent. Let's keep it going. Let's build on it. We went through a painful year of Build Back Better. In which predominantly 2 senators throttled a lot of the ambition there.
Which 2 senators are you talking?
Oh, man, they happen to be up in 2024.
Sanders and Warren.
You might be playing in some primaries there, Maurice.
Maybe.
But I think, in Senator Manchin, so we went through a difficult, tendentious fight. And at the end of it, we got the Inflation Reduction Act. And I want to echo, everything that Anna was saying about the idea that you can't just go back and say, hey, we came, we saw it, we conquered, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, everybody's success, we're done here. Because if that's the message, then what are we voting for you to maintain office for? What's next? Give me the next 2, 3, 4 things that we're going to do. And I guess to my dismay here, that some of the things that were left on the chopping block almost felt like they left the public conversation. Like in expanding Medicare was one of those, expanding child care, right? Imagine when inflation continues to rise and higher in people's minds, and you're not talking about that. One way I got to deal with your family cost of living is I have a plan for making child care more accessible and affordable for you. And I think the paid sick leave, there were some elements there that felt like you could maintain, give me 2 more Senate seats, and we're coming back for more, in a way that builds credibility with the audience. Because what I sensed and felt from some in a Democratic Party was that we passed American Rescue Plan, we did CHIPS, we did infrastructure, and then we did the Inflation Reduction Act, all significant accomplishments. And we flinch because we might think that maybe the progressive economics that we were pursuing, in which we did stimulus and Medicare prescription drug negotiation, student debt relief, and domestic manufacturing, maybe that was bad. And you could feel it in the air. Tell me I'm wrong. Like maybe we shouldn't be loud and proud about talking about why we did that stimulus check. Let's not talk about that anymore. And you're like, what? No, the idea is to advocate and argue that it was right. It delivered 2 Senate seats in Georgia, by the way, one of the major reasons to deliver 2 Senate seats in Georgia. And yet it felt like we walked away, not only from the advocacy and the defense of the things we did, and the things that got left on the chopping block in Build Back Better. You build credibility and say, and we're coming back for more, and here's why. And I think we, to some degree, lost the thread of why we did those things, why they mattered, why they're effective, and why they're a better solution than whatever a crazy MAGA movement is trying to put on the table.
I don't think it's too much of a debate, but there were 2 sort of differences that were expressed here. So I want Anna to respond to his contention that there wasn't enough talk about economics, and I don't think he said there wasn't any, but I don't want to talk you respond to that. And then Maurice, respond to her comment that student loan debt, we can't really talk to people about, but we have to be careful about that, because you get at that, but it's sort of reconcile what you said with what she said on that, if you don't mind. So Anna first.
Sure. I mean, I agree with much of what was said on the panel, but I just, for a friendly amendment about we didn't talk about these issues, I think actually Democratic candidates, I can only speak for the many that we did in my firm, talked about economy a lot in a bunch of different ways. And so I did Mark Kelly's polling, and I would say 1/3 of our ads, and I think we ran about 70, were on the economy, including not just prescription drugs and healthcare, but chips, supply chain, trucking. I loved the trucking ad. If you guys ever watched the trucking ad, it was one of the last ads that we ran. And so, in fact, throughout the campaign, we basically were like, every third ad has to be on the economy. And I think if you go and look at Matt Cartwright, another race I did, about half of our ads were on the economy, same kinds of issues. And by the way, also mentioning things like corporate greed and that sort of thing. And also, not this is the economy per se, but a lot of discussion of not taking corporate PAC money, about who you're for. And so I would just disagree that we didn't talk about them. I do think overall, we have a challenge building on this and going forward, because while I completely agree that there is a lot more work to do in all of these areas, many pieces of Build Back Better, like paid leave, which didn't happen, need to happen. I also think that we need to be more expansive in our economic messaging and think about a growth message, not just a kind of redistribution message. People where Biden actually has his strongest numbers is on job creation. He's at about 67% disapprove on inflation, and actually about split 50-50 on approve, disapprove on jobs. That's an enormous accomplishment for a Democrat. Usually we lose on who's good at creating jobs. And so, we should be thinking about what does a growth economy look like? What does equitable growth look like? We should be talking as much about people who don't go to college as we talk about student loan debt. And I think that has to be where we go next. Every cycle I poll on apprenticeships and skills training and alternatives to college, and and it's always, it is cross-partisan, cross-class, cross-age. It is incredibly popular. I work for Michelle Lujan Grisham. Now it's free to go to college and trade schools in New Mexico. We advertised about that. I think that we have to, and we really focused in Michelle Lujan Grisham's race on kind of growing the economy in New Mexico, not just things like spending on education and healthcare. And I think that's where we have to go. So I'm hoping that as we think about what progressive economic policy looks like, especially in divided government, you actually have a whole lot of Republicans who actually support, apprenticeships and skills training and trade schools and free community college. I think that we need to be more expansive in how we talk about economic policy.
This is the student debt question.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these issues are complicated, and there's a lot of ways to read a poll. Like, I'm an organizer, right? So the way that I use polling is to get a baseline for where we are, not where we're going, right? That's the work that we need to do through the organizing. And so, for example, we did some polling and we understood that generically Democrats had some credibility issues as it related to public safety and as it related to the economy in some areas. When I read that, I didn't think, oh, all of the candidates that we're endorsing, they should be afraid of their shadow as it relates to public safety and as it relates to the economy. That just helped me understand that we needed to come up with a rigorous, clear, and authentic progressive response that stands on our issues and our values as it relates to those things. And so, to me, any rigorous response in the area of the economy has to talk about student debt relief and how that is transforming people's lives, and other things, of course. Additionally, in order for us to have the outcome that we had on Tuesday, we needed, and Democrats and progressives needed their base to understand that all of the work and the voting and the organizing that they had done last cycle was for some purpose, right? And those concrete proof points in people's lives and the very specific items that the president had ran on and delivered on was a recognition that people in the base who were the millions and millions of volunteer hours that were calling their neighbors and calling and connecting to other voters and turning people out in churches, and that led to these razor-thin margins. It was an element that led to the victory. And so whether or not there's segments of the population that might frown on student debt relief, it doesn't take away from how important it was in mobilizing and energizing people that people like me need to organize. And I also think it's like the intensity and salience of that issue may not reflect in all of the polling in terms of the percentage of people that may or may not be for it in a binary test of whether or not you agree with it. And what I could tell you, and this is more anecdotal, is that there was an intensity that happened. I mean, 26 million people registered for that. I think that demonstrates how intensely people felt about that as a real need, and how that translated into people really feeling, because there was a disconnect and people were wondering at a certain point near the summer, why is it that I vote for Democrats? And I think a lot of that gap was closed by things like the student debt relief and this drumbeat of solutions that people are either feeling in their lives or they're anticipating, and that shifted expectations that helped the organizing on the ground, and I think ultimately helped electoral outcomes.
Let me jump. We talked about this a little bit last week. You have Florida passed the minimum wage in 2020. A bunch of states have passed them last few cycles, but all these states are red states. So abortion, a proposal to ban abortion fails in Kentucky. You had Medicaid expansion passed in South Dakota, very, very red. So talk about the voter who votes for democratic or progressive economic policies, but also votes for Rand Paul or votes for John Thune. Who is that person in your view, and can Democrats win those people's actual votes?
Perry and I were having a conversation, so he's teeing me up for exactly what you wanted to discuss. And I'll jump right off the point that, and I agree with a lot of what Anna was saying, and I think that, an economy was the number one issue in everybody's mind, so it was the number one issue for the persuasion audience, so of course we had to say something and we had to be talking about the economy. My nuanced, slight difference of opinion is, were we talking about enough in a way that animated a distinction and a difference in the brand of what the Democratic Party is and stands for? I think we've got a lot of room to run on. I think we got a lot of room to make. And it goes right into the conversation that Perry's teeing me up for, which is, where's the audience that we're trying to build towards? And it's a multiracial, diverse, working class coalition across America. And what we know about those working class voters is they voted in Nebraska for a $15 minimum wage. They voted, for Medicaid expansion in South Dakota. They are, and even in Arizona, they passed a predatory medical debt law. And, Oregon passed a healthcare as a human right law. I think that there is, in my view, a strong consensus when you do economic justice issues that speak to working class issues that go to 60+% of the American public. And when you're living in that bread and butter, it is our expansion universe. It is our persuasion universe. If we are speaking to people and wanting to get beyond the 50% needed to win an election and to say, how do we get to 52, 53, 54? I'm arguing very boldly for a strong working class brand, party, and definition around these issues that requires, in my mind, and I'm open to other perspectives and thoughts and ideas on it, is that it in some sense, it needs to break through in the audiences and the voters' minds that is what defines a Democrat. That means that there was a fight and a friction that these guys picked against power. They went up against them. I saw it animated before me on the TV set. And when push came to shove, those guys were on my side and those guys were not. And it just means getting a little bit stronger on how we practice politics. The tension in some of these conversations is when we're producing good progressive policy, does it match good progressive politics? And sometimes, in my view, and I think the progressive wing of our party feels like, that politics needs to have fight. It needs to have animation of a fight, and a fight against corporate greed. Are you willing to take it on and show people that we are willing to go up against powerful actors? It goes to the heart of what I believe a Democrat is that you're saying that in a world of many influential powers, and wealth has a ton of power, that somebody has to fight for people. And if all we do here is live and work for profit, we're not looking out for the values of working people who are left behind. So who's going to be willing to take on profit-maximizing individuals, profit-seeking individuals, wealthy individuals? Who's willing to take them on for people? So if it isn't work for the market to provide paid sick leave, who's going to fight for my paid sick leave? If it doesn't work for the market to provide a rural hospital, who's going to fight for my rural hospital, my rural health care? If it doesn't work for the market to reduce student debt, who's going to fight for me? And so while we execute a policy, and I think we're moving in a good and positive direction on progressive economics, I give a lot of credit to Biden, Ron Klain, and the whole team there of just pushing this pile in the right direction. It also needs the animation in the public's mind, that is what defines these guys. Holy cow, these Democrats, they are willing to fight for me and take on power. And I think we got a lot of room to run. And where we have done it well, and I think there's some areas where I feel like this goes into a larger conversation on recruitment of candidates and what type of candidates you're putting up and, how do you animate these conversations. But I'm really happy about Fetterman's rise over the course of a few short years, and even there's a young, talented woman in Washington State who beat Joe Kent in an R+13 district named Marie Glushin-Camp Perez, auto repair shop owner, and here she is, wasn't sure she even wanted to run. She gets in the arena, boom, takes down one of the most impressive wins, and here's a working class person. So I think there's a lot of things entangled in everything that I'm saying, but if you had your North Star of what are we trying to do? Get working class voters back. That's our job. And we're just very quickly before I conclude, before we get very laudatory about what happened, it's dangerous that we lose a popular vote in 2022, right? It is. And even if you go back to 2020 and reckon with 2022, you're still needing to reckon with in a crazy, after 4 years of Trump and watching that disaster of an S show, that you still have a lot of people saying you're going to vote for the House Republicans, and we're still in a polarized tribal climate. I get it. We are in polarized tribal. The way out of it is to kind of reach these middle class, working class voters.
Either one you want to add? Either one of you want to add anything onto that? No. Okay, good. That's because I have two more questions, and then we'll go to the audience. What are this taking Biden trifecta in Washington? What are the two things you were glad the Congress and the president enacted, and then what is one thing you really think was either a mistake or really left on the table?
I mean, I think that infrastructure and chips, I will go back to my point about economic growth and equitable growth and being the party of growth and job creation. I think those two pieces of legislation allow us to, I think, create and build a narrative about how we want to provide good paying jobs, stable jobs, jobs with benefits. And I think that is, if talking about kind of cross-class coalitions and cross-racial coalitions, I don't think anybody disagrees with that sort of agenda. And I think that we should be doing more of it. And I'll go back to skills training and apprenticeships and community college and alternatives to college. I think that kind of growth economy, supply chain, domestic manufacturing, Republicans, and I should have added supporting small businesses who actually create most of the jobs in this country. And I think that people perceive that Republicans are much more interested in small businesses than Democrats are. And, if we're going to compete and make the contrast that we're talking about with Republicans, we have to be people that people trust on the economy. They trust us on our values. They think that we're for regular people, that we care about poor people. They think that, that we're advocates. After the 2012 election, Obama in the exit polls was seen as better on supporting the middle class, but Romney was seeing better on the economy and job creation. We need to own both of those spaces, right, in order to compete with the Republicans on the economy. And so I thought that chips and infrastructure, and we advertised extensively on those issues in our races, just kind of creates this foundation for being about equitable growth.
One thing you wish he had done or something didn't go well? Wish they'd done.
I got to be honest with you, I thought we wildly exceeded any expectation of doing anything. And so to me, it was like a cornucopia of accomplishments that we could talk about in the campaign. So it's hard, I'll think about it, but I was pretty excited about what was accomplished.
I'm a journalist, we think only in terms of
Right.
negativity, but
Okay.
others don't. Go ahead, Marie.
No, I mean, there's a lot of the agenda that remains to go through or be passed, right? Like, there was a huge opportunity around structure, like in a moment where actual fascists nearly won power in key states and are planning to take over our federal government. We had opportunity to pass some structural democracy reform that we didn't. And I think that was malpractice, that didn't happen. And also, there were components of the Build Back Better agenda that included the care economy, right, that was left on the floor. And we need to figure out how to pick that up. I mean, there's so many, Democrats, I think, yes, there were accomplishments, and when you take a step back and the fact that there's trillions of dollars of resources sent directly to state and local governments and directly to taxpayers and to individuals, that's significant, it's historic. And in that governing window, there's still a lot more that I think could have been done. I think it was a mistake. It's interesting, like I disagree strategically that we should have separated have a bipartisan sort of infrastructure bill, because I think that sort of lessened the demand for us to actually have a larger package. And then at the end of the day, like, the two senators that you talked about, ended, and as well as a number of people in the House, a few of which we primaried, and some of which won't be coming back to Congress, created the conditions where they sabotaged the full agenda. And I think that was a mistake. And, when Democrats have the ability, I agree, like every single day, people should get it in their heads that what Democrats or progressives, what we do is every single day, we look for opportunities to fight for working people and to fight against organized capital and have a legislative agenda that tells that story. And I think there were missed opportunities in doing that in terms of this. I mean, again, it's kind of wild to even say this because the scale was intense, but the scale could have been even more if we didn't have two senators that kind of blocked, stymied, and slowed down the progress, and sometimes arbitrarily, like what's the difference between 379 billion and 308? It's like some of the stuff is just like maddening. Even though we did a lot, we could have done a lot more, and I want us to have that appetite to do more. We could do both. We could celebrate the wins and actually demand more, and I want us to figure out how to do both.
President Biden and his team are doing some impressive things on corporate accountability. We've got a great antitrust effort going on. Some of that has included making things like hearing aids broadly accessible and affordable to a lot of people. And when you're trying to think about how you animate those issues for people, we obviously got to work on building a distribution of information so that people do know these kinds of things are happening. But there's also got to be animation around it. I think our politics is still yet catching up to an area that Biden is leading the Democratic Party on, because you would have gone back many decades, and these kinds of things you wouldn't have necessarily seen in a robust antitrust agenda from prior Democratic presidents. Now you do, so now you need politics catching up to it. So how do you start going out and talking about, here's what actions we've got going? One, slight critique or constructive criticism of people as we get into policy design. You pass something like Inflation Reduction Act, and I appreciate that you're going to have to reach compromise, and you're going to have to bring down your hopes and of what you wanted to get done. The one thing that was a sense of frustration for me is when you know you're about to pass something, put something in there that's immediately beneficial. Immediately, but to the thing that Anna's raising. We should be able to go out and talk to people about, yes, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. There's 5 provisions that are going to hit over the next 3-4 years that are going to have some impact. But what we definitely did in the next few months is we made insulin $20 for you, right? And whatever it might be, that one thing that I'm going to do, Medicare is now at 64, so when you retire at 64, you're going to get it now instead of 65. Whatever it might be, you give something that is tangible, that people can feel, touch, smell, and I think this is a particularly unique challenge for us as Democrats rather than Republicans, because we believe in government. And because you believe in government, you have a cynical populist, particularly in the persuasion audience that you're working against, people who might not believe that government can do anything anymore. And you're saying, hey, we're making it work for you. Trust us. We're going to get domestic manufacturing back. We're going to build these jobs. And I trust that there is going to be this. It's a long haul. You're going to shovels are going to ground. It's going to take a while. But one of the ways you start to restore and build that confidence is, boom, I got something that immediately touches you. That's why I thought the stimulus was really critical, right? It's touching you, you feel it, you sense it, that yes, this would not have happened in my life were it not for a Democrat. And I think as we get into more policy design conversations and merging them with politics, I hope that more people are incorporating that line of thinking, is that we're going to pass these kinds of bills, got to have something in there that we're going to immediately go tell people about.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you raise your hand, we'll find you a mic. I loved if you make a question and not a comment. If you say I'm going to make a comment then a question, I'm going to roll my eyes in front of you. So, and also I failed to ask what President Biden can get done with Speaker McCarthy. So if you can try to incorporate that in whatever the question is, please do that as well. So do you have any questions? Sure. I don't know where the microphones are, to be honest with you. So I can hear you. He's up here.
All right, I could just ask here.
Yeah, go ahead.
People are right. I guess my question would be, I can take my mask off now. Sorry, my name is Jin Woo. I'm here with Groundwork. I have a question about what do you think kind of changed so that President Biden was able to kind of be more forceful on some of these economic policies compared to previous Democratic administrations? Do you think it's just a difference in the context? Do you think there's a difference in the man who occupies the Oval Office? Maybe something with... Oh, thank you. Sorry. So yeah, I just would love to hear your thoughts about that. And what's the path moving forward? Do you feel like Biden will moderate more of his policies, or actually go deeper into kind of some of these issues?
Feel free to take credit, both of you. But go ahead. But go ahead.
I think there's two things: the conditions, the fact that he was president in a moment of intense overlapping crises that required robust public policy from the government and significant investment. And then Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, the primaries and the movement around the primaries and the mass movements that were demanding, and then were a key component of his electoral sort of majority that led to his victory. I think the combination of those two things created the conditions for Biden to legislate and the Democrats to legislate in a much more robust and progressive way.
Just want to say two things. One, I also think Biden is genuinely a populist, right? And I think if you look at his background and his work as a senator and then as vice president, I just think he's genuinely a populist and genuinely opposes, massive corporate power. The other is none of this would have happened without Nancy Pelosi. I just got to give her a shout out because that was a very small majority in the House, and she killed it.
No, on the Pelosi point, we always take for granted. Remember, John Boehner led the House, and then Paul Ryan led the House. There were always these factions and efforts, and they bring votes up, and they would sometimes fail. They never knew what the vote count was. Never happens with Nancy Pelosi. When she brings it up, it wins, and we take it for granted, as Anna said. I think that when you look at the movement, the progressive movement, it certainly stems back to 15. When certainly I think we were building a desire to say that there was a lot of silent pain and suffering out in the world that the Democratic Party needed to speak to, and that movement started to build. And I think successfully, not only politically, which I think gained a ton of attention in Senator Sanders' two runs, and as Maurice mentioned, Senator Warren and others, just showing that there's a lot of desire for it. But I also think we want an intellectual battle. Because what Maurice is mentioning, it matched with reality. Reality was catching up. You say, hey, if people are falling this far behind on student debt, if they're falling this far behind on a cruel and dysfunctional healthcare system, aren't you going to have to say something about the prescription drug crisis? We lived through COVID, and you have people struggling, not going to work. What kind of a system is going to be there in place? Well, they happen to be progressives. They happen to be what we've been arguing for the better part of 4 or 5 years. So we've meshed those things together. And to Anna's point, in Biden not only, I think, having a working class DNA, but I think more importantly around his political composition, which it's old school politics, which is that he's willing to be persuaded. So he doesn't tend to dig in and say, this is my ideology and where I stand. Student debt, for those of you who followed it all, right? If you track the trajectory of that over the course of, I lived it during the primary and watched where his positions were, and then here's the president executing student debt plan that was very different than some of the things he was saying in the primary. It's a credit. It's a positive when you have a president and the team is willing to say, pressure me. I welcome the pressure. Build a movement. Convince me. Persuade me. And if you happen to be right, I'm going to move my position. And I think all of us have taken that to say, okay, great. We will. We'll make constructive criticism, and hopefully it will persuade you. And I think to his credit, he is often persuaded on these things.
Other questions? In the front here. Go ahead.
I'll just go. Maurice, you're New York-based, or your organization has deep roots in New York. The margin in the House looks like it'll be almost completely explained by New York, if not totally. What's going on in New York State?
Anna's going to answer too, because she explained this to me before we came on. But
there's many ways to answer that question. The story actually, begins with so Governor Cuomo.
you're a big fan.
We have a relationship. So his appointees on the court are the conservative appointees in the court. When Democrats passed their lines after redistricting, which were competitive and good for Democrats, Republicans reliably sued and went to the courts. And the block of Cuomo appointees sided with the Republicans and set into motion a chain of events that led to the outcome that we're in right now. And so the lines no longer benefited Democrats. It caused a mad scramble for seats, and we had, including the chair of the DCCC, leaving his seat and bumping another congressperson out of their seat to go to a seat that he thought was better. He lost, by the way. The seat that he left was actually won by another candidate. The point is, it turned into chaos, right? And the other piece was that the Democratic Party infrastructure was not the most robust infrastructure right? Like you have Democratic parties like Wisconsin, which I think is like a gold standard of what a Democratic Party can be. And then you have the Democratic Party of New York, which is anemic. And they didn't have the capacity. They raised and spent like upwards of $40 million, mainly on television ads. And there was very little of the operation that you would need to have statewide in order to get where you needed to go. And then it was just like I think because of those lines, some very, very tough races. But it's a combination of political mistakes, the demographic realities, and then electoral errors in terms of how you're like actually building a robust Democratic Party infrastructure on the ground. The shining light, I'm going to take credit for this, is that we had a very robust Working Families Party infrastructure. And, Long Island Newsday, which is no paragon of leftist thought, credited the Working Families Party in part in making the difference because we were doing the turnout and the voter contact around the state in order to get Democrats and progressives to come to the polls.
Hannah.
So I completely agree that redistricting is at the heart of the losses, but I would also just note that in 2021, especially on Long Island, Republicans swept a huge number of offices, and so people focused on Virginia and New Jersey and the shift there, but there was a major shift in New York. And I've polled on Long Island in all those districts in their various incarnations for about 10 years. It is a light blue, I'd say, / light pink. It is not a super liberal or progressive part of New York. It's very diverse, not just racially, but diverse kind of economically. And there's some very conservative pockets. So it is a part of New York that's actually changing and becoming more conservative. And we see that in prior elections. The other piece is, if you looked at the individual candidates in those races, you did not have the candidate quality issues among the Republican nominees that you had in other places. You actually had very good Republican candidates and arguably some weak Democratic candidates. And then, no question, on-the-ground organizing and party organization is very weak. But it's also a very expensive place because the New York media market is so prohibitively expensive. It's a very expensive place to actually play in politics. And so what happens is the independent expenditures are mostly the people who can afford to go on broadcast, and they come in late because it's so expensive. And so this kind of late advertising in a really hard place to communicate just makes it very hard to run effective campaigns. It's just a very, very challenging place if you're going to focus so heavily on television.
All right, so I'll take the last question myself, and I'm going to ask Faz first. So I wanted to ask, what's one thing Joe Biden should do in the next 2 years? Speaker McCarthy is going to stop a lot of big bills. So maybe you can lay out what is one fight he should have, or one thing, pick a villain he should choose, because of what you're talking about. You've hinted throughout about the idea you should choose someone. Maurice, talk about one thing, bill, executive order. Maybe Anna, you can explain some kind of education policy for non-college people that you think he should do, or pilot or something, because you've hinted at it a couple times, so go ahead.
I mean, I start with a lot of the opportunity around economic justice issues that are across the board, I think would put Republicans in an interesting and difficult box, right? So you start with the idea that, McCarthy's going to have chaos on his hands and it'll be fun to watch him deal with it. And you're saying, okay, well, I just need 4 or 5 votes here. Let's see if we can peel some people off and then have a Senate, hopefully 51 votes there to move it through and get it to the president's desk. If that's what you come to every day thinking about, at least legislatively, putting aside executive orders, which I think there's a fair amount he could and should be thinking about. Say legislatively, I still think a lot of the things that I was suggesting politically that were popular to run on in an election would still be popular now. You expand Social Security. Go ahead. Let's have a conversation about it. And you would know that most of the Republican factions will say, oh, we got to save Social Security by cutting Social Security. We got to da-da-da-da-da. And great, let's have this debate. Let's go. Let's have a wonderful conversation about expanding Medicare. Let entice and invite them into that one, because I think it would animate the differences in a very clear way. And also, not only could you potentially win it policy-wise, but I think you could also just animate it politically for heading into 2024. In addition to that, I think that if you get more technical and you think about the decimation of rural America and places where I think Republicans are crushing. If you go places like Texas and you look at the margins there in rural America, and you look at the Senate seats that are up, in 2024, right? They're also back to Wisconsin and Michigan, or Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. To the extent that we could win a Senate seat in 2024, it would have to be in a place like Texas or Florida, right? Those are the seats that are up. We're mostly playing defense a lot of places that you think about some of the geographies, and you're saying, okay, who speaks to the needs? Let's put populism to paper. Like you claim to be Ron DeSantis claims to be some working class hero. Great, let's go. Let's see us put together an agenda that on, either dealing with corporate accountability, puts it to them, says, hey, who is willing to stand up to big energy regulators hiking prices on you? Who's willing to do that? And I think even one other issue is housing in this country has continued to get more and more affordable and more difficult for so many people across the country. It is Republicans are standing in the way of giving us opportunities to expand affordable housing in this country. So there's some areas that I think could just be interesting and compelling to just animate the differences.
Well, if you're talking about an executive order, I just think out of moral obligation to continued life on this planet, I'd love to see an executive order for a climate emergency, right? Just putting aside the politics. And as much investments the Inflation Reduction Act sort of was able to deliver around climate, there's still more work we need to do there. I think in terms of sharpening the contrast, anything around political corruption, I think is an opportunity. Those are issues that are widely popular with people across political persuasions. And it sharpens the contrast in a very interesting way. And like really leaning into some of the possible legislation, and this gets really contentious because this is where a lot of Democrats disagree, but legislation that limits, for example, sitting members to their ability to trade on the markets and other things like that. It just creates a very stark clarity again around Democrats and who they're with and who they're saying they're not with. Additionally, I would agree, legislation that deals with people's fundamental material conditions like expanding childcare, right? Which again is wildly popular and, right? It's wildly popular, and I think it'll draw Republicans into a corner where even a lot of people in their base would demand things like that and recognize how that would shift their material conditions, but it isn't neatly within sort of the area in which Republicans generally get to ideologically. And I think sharpening the contrast and delivering things that are popular across our differences are good policy, politics, a good setup for 2024.
Real quick, Anna, before you go, just real quick, I was going to add capping credit card interest rates. Very, very popular. You could see it speak to material cost of living. But anyway, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
That's good. I mean, actually, I was going to talk about climate too, and I think that is, if you, in the presidential primary in 2019 and 2020, prior to COVID, you actually heard, there was a huge, there was a Green New Deal, and that was framed in a certain way that was attractive to Democratic primary voters, but not necessarily more broadly, which I thought was unfortunate. But climate was, for Democratic primary voters and Democrats, was right up there with, abortion and political corruption as like the top issues. And then you had COVID and it kind of collapsed and everything got wiped away. But we were actually starting to see the climate issue becoming really, really, really important to Democrats. And I think that there's an opportunity to talk about it, not just in terms of the environment and being able to live, exist as humans, but as an economic issue, and to do it in ways that are very specific to the different circumstances in the way it affects people. So do a lot of work in the Southwest around public lands, and you can talk to ranchers about the fact that there's drought and they can't use their land because of climate change, right? Certainly hurricanes in Florida. There's the natural disasters and the extreme weather that comes from climate change, but then there's also a more positive side around job creation, jobs for people who don't go to college but are still good paying jobs and require skills. So I don't think anything's going to happen. I don't think any legislation is going to pass, to be honest with you. But I think that we need to come back to climate in a very profound way. We were getting there, and then we got set back during COVID, and I think we need to get back to it.
This is a great panel. Thank you all for your candor. Thanks for your answers, and thank you all for having us.